Hi, my name is Brent Riggs, and my website is SeriousFaith.com. And we're going to be looking at part 12 of our Genesis Bible study, Genesis chapter 1 to 11. We're on part 12, and we are at verses 14 and 19 of Genesis 1. So Genesis 1, starting in verse 14, then let's read through verse 19. And God said, "Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth." And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, and it was the fourth day. Well, let's start with a prayer. Lord, thank you for the wonderful chapter of Genesis 1 that tells us exactly how you created things. Help us to dig into the depths of your description of creation and help us to know the wonders and the marvels of your power and the glory that it brings you as we discover how you created things and why you created things as a gift to us and to show your glory and the power that you have. For all these things in Jesus' name, amen. All right, so the fourth day of creation. So we've got the sun and the moon and the stars. Now, for 3 days, there had been light during the day, as though there were a sun, and a lesser light at night, as though there were moon and stars. And God could have left it that way, but He didn't. He created the lights, the sun, the moon, and the stars, not for the light, because the light already existed, but to serve as uh, ways that we could measure the signs and the seasons, the days, the years, events, and more things that we'll talk about here as we go on. And keep in mind that all of our timekeeping is built on things that we can see in the physical universe, except one thing, one very clear thing, and that is the 7 day week. You know, you're not going to find anything out in the physical universe that measures that length of time. That's something that comes strictly from the creation week of the Bible, and that's really kind of an authentication too of the accuracy of the Bible, because that's kind of built into humans and always have a 7 day week. Where did that come from? Well, there's only one place that it came from, and it came from the creation story in Genesis. So God created the sun and the moon and the stars. He says they were given for signs. Now it's interesting, and we're not going to get off into it. If you remember, this was popularized by a preacher who's now deceased, a pastor named D. James Kennedy, who was a very excellent Bible teacher, and he would preach a message about how the original zodiac signs you could look up in the stars, and he gave the message of the gospel and God's plan for humanity up in the stars, and the original generations would have told that story by looking at the stars. It's really an interesting study. It's I wouldn't call it you know biblical doctrine or anything by any stretch, but if you ever get a chance to listen to it, it's very interesting. Look up the letter D like David, D. James Kennedy and his messages on the zodiac in Genesis. Very interesting stuff. All right, but we do have. Let's go to what the Bible says. We're talking about these signs. And first of all, it would be signs of weather. You know, you look up in the heavens and you can kind of tell what the weather's going to be. In Matthew 16, verses 2 to 3, it gives us an example of this. And it said, He answered them, that's Jesus. He said, when it is evening, you say, it's going to be fair weather because the sky is red. And in the morning, it's going to be stormy today, for the sky is red and threatening. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky. That's the signs that look up in the heavens for signs. And of course, that's all because of the atmosphere and the sun and light and all of that. But you cannot interpret the signs of the time. So we do indeed look up into the firmament, into the heavens for signs that even give us an indication of what the weather's going to be. Now, I don't have time to read big chapters of it, but Psalms 8, Psalms 19, Romans chapter 1 tells us that creation and the signs in the heavens are a testimony of who God is. And that's what the Bible tells us, that every man is without excuse. They can't go before God and say, "Hey, I don't know who you were. I never heard of you. I had no idea you existed," because Paul, especially in Romans 1, tells us that the heavens declare the glory of God, and that because of creation, creation cries out the testimony that God exists. And so we're all without excuse. We can't stand before God and say, we didn't have any way of knowing you were out there. How could we be accountable to you? No, none of us can do that, because the signs in the heavens give testimony that God exists, not to mention the creation of the earth and human life and all of that. But we're talking about specifically now the stars and the sun and the moon and the heavens. Now, those same things can then also be a sign of divine judgment. In Joel chapter 2, verse 30, it says, "And I will show wonders in the heavens and on the earth, blood and fire and columns of smoke." So it says, "I'll show wonders in the heavens." Now, if you know the context of Joel chapter 2, of course, this is talking about the end of days. In that day, that time period at the very end of God's plan for humanity, divine judgment will be poured out on the earth, and there will be wonders and signs in the heaven that declare this judgment is on the way and is occurring. Now, of course, that echoes what Jesus said in Matthew 24, verse 29. He said, "Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven." So there's all three things that Genesis 1 is talking about: the sun, the moon, the stars. The sun is darkened. The moon, of course, doesn't give light because it reflects the sun. And the stars, like asteroids, meteors, things like that, are going to fall. And it says the powers of heaven will be shaken. So these are more signs in the heavens. Now, again, that is a sign of God's impending judgment on us. Again, it goes back to Genesis. It says He didn't have to give us those things. He had already created light. He could have left light the way it was, but he gave us generators or sources or origins of those lights, physical objects that would then be signs to us for certain things that God wanted to convey or communicate to us. Now, of course, we know those things: the sun, the moon, and the stars are also used for navigation. And we've known that from the earliest times of man's history, that we have anything recorded about it, that man was using the sun, the moon, and the stars. They used to navigate all of the oceans and the seas thousands of years ago by being able to navigate by the stars, by what they saw in the heavens. Matthew 2, verses 1 and 2 says, "Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and we came to worship him." So here's one of the stars that became a sign of Jesus' birth. Now, we don't know how that happened. Did God flare up a certain star? Was it the Shekinah glory of God that we find in the Old Testament? We don't know, but to them it appeared to be a star, and it caught their attention, and it was obviously different, and they followed it. God placed it in their hearts to follow this star, to come and worship the King of the Jews, the Messiah. And one other thing, of course, that the stars in the heavens tell us about the seasons. The Earth's movement in relationship to the sun and the moon determines our calendar, determines our seasons. Spring, summer, winter, and fall, and all that has to do with the sun and the moon and the earth and all of that. So we see those are signs as well. So Genesis is correct. God created those things for signs for us, and even to this day, thousands of years later, they are still signs, just like Genesis said, which again just more proves the authenticity of the Genesis account. It's not silly mythology. It's not absurd things that we know can't be true. These are real things that still persist to this day, exactly like Genesis said they would be, and for the purpose that God said he put them there. So on the first day of creation, then God created, and he energized the entire universe. And everything that God was going to create was there, and he was now creating purpose for it. He was energizing it, making it into what he wanted it to be. And so he began by the second day, he created the hydrosphere, and he created the atmosphere, what we would call the firmament, our atmosphere around the earth. And then, the water, that said the waters separated from the waters. We'll talk more about that later. The water canopy type theory that probably existed before Noah's flood. And then, of course, the firmaments of the heavens and the stars. And he's just about to create the stars here in a minute when we get to that part in this passage. But then on the third day, he created the lithosphere, which is the rigid outer part of the earth, what we would call the crust or the mantle. And then he created the biosphere. That's all of the plants. And he did that on the third day. So now we've arrived at the fourth day, and this is when he's going to create the stars and the planets and the moon and all of the things that are out in what we would call outer space in the terrestrial sphere. Now, on the first day, he said, let there be light. And so there was light. Remember, light is a physical thing. It didn't exist before in the form that we know it, because everything that exists in our universe, including light, was something God created. Now, he exists in light himself, but however this was, he created physical light to exist in our universe. But then on the fourth day, he said, let there be lights, not let there be light. That was the product of light itself. He said, let there be lights, or what the Hebrew says there is, let there be light givers. So he created things that generated this light that he had already created. He could have just left it the way it was, and light would have existed. And apparently the light that he originally created before the sun and the moon and the stars shone on the earth the same way the sun does. It mimicked that same kind of shining, because we knew that there was morning and evening, and there was day and night, and it was one day. So whatever that original light was, God caused it to shine on the earth and the moon, shine on the earth, so that we would still get what we would call days. But then he said, hey, I'm going to create a sun where that light comes from our point of view, from our existence, and then a moon that's going to reflect that light. And those will be light givers, not just light, but light givers, light producers, light generators. Now, some, we look at this, and of course the world would say, it's impossible that there were plants or light before there were stars, and they say that makes the Bible inaccurate. Actually, what this does is it proves the authenticity of Scripture, because you know what? If man would have come up with the Genesis story, we would have never said light was created first, and then the generators of light were created after that. That's exactly the opposite of what we would have said if we were just making up a creation story to try to fit this scenario. We would have never planned it that way. So, all of this smacks of being true, that light is a real thing, that light is generated by a light giver. And again, science, even though most of science today will say science disproves Genesis, when you look at it with an open mind, and especially comparing it to all the silly myths out there of other creation stories from pagan societies, the Genesis account is actually very scientifically accurate. It's not a silly myth. It's not absurdity of a turtle with a watery egg on its back for all of eternity or some crud like that. I mean, this is a real scientifically accurate account of how our physical reality came about, if it came about by a creator, and he told us how he did things. So it's, if it wasn't the Bible, people would accept it. But since it's the Bible, we don't accept it, because that means we have to be accountable to the creator. But the chief purpose of the light on the first 3 days, and then the light givers of all the light of the subsequent days after that, here on day 4, was to divide the light from the darkness. And that's what gives us our, night and day, and our, ability to tell time and all that kind of stuff. So God created this. Sometimes when we think of God said, let there be light, that maybe just everything was lit up. But it said, no, he separated the darkness from the light, giving us day and night, which is our rhythm of life and how we measure things. And so this was given to us to mark the signs and the seasons and the days. and the years. Now, all that light, whether it's from our sun or from all of the other countless, and we're going to talk about in a little while, trillions and trillions of stars, was all created and ready to go in place. And people say, well, that's not true because if there's a star and it's a billion light years away, that proves that the universe is at least a billion years old. But that makes a lot of assumptions that we can't prove and we can't state as a fact. First of all, remember that creation was a series of miraculous events. And so God could have easily, if God was the creator of light, he could have created light from a star that's a billion years away in place. He just said, let there be light, and all the light from all the stars, no matter how far away they are, were created in place, ready to go, reaching the earth. Even though they were 10 seconds old, God created that light to span and traverse that distance between here and where that star would eventually be on day 4, whether it's 93 million miles to the sun or whether it's hundreds of billions of light years to another star. Plus, we also know from our study of physics, from relativity and Einstein and lots of very exceptional theories that have to do with light, that we know that light isn't constant. See, we tend to think that how we measure light on the earth with its speed and how it acts and the properties of it, how we can reach out into our sphere and measure it scientifically here must be the exact same way that light works 100 billion light years away. But do we really know that? No, we don't. We don't know. We're assuming that light in the entire universe acts exactly the same way, at the same speed, by the same method, in exactly the same scientific way that we can observe right here on Earth. But there are lots of models of relativity and space curvature and black holes that prove that light works at different speeds in different ways. And in fact, they have some very interesting models that can show that light from what we would think is almost an infinite distance from us can reach us very quickly, sometimes almost instantaneously. So the point being here is not to say come up with some sort of science that proves that Genesis is right. It's just to let you know that don't be fooled by the simplistic statement of saying, well, if a star is a million light years away, then the earth has to be a million years old. That has been proven false. Now, it doesn't mean that it completely disproves the idea of the earth being millions of years old. That one thing in and of itself won't prove that, but it does prove that just because a star is a million light years away, the Earth has to be a million years old. That is not proof of that at all. Even from modern science and physics, we know that is not a fact. Plus, you always have to take into account, of course, we can't know how light behaves a billion light years from here, hundreds of millions of light years away. We can't know how light acts out there and how all of the almost infinite universe behaves. We assume that it all behaves exactly the what we see here on Earth, but that's just that. It's an assumption. Anyway, don't want to get too far off on that. I just wanted to make that point before we move on. Now, both in Scripture, both the sun and the moon are called light givers, but of course we know that the moon reflects light. Now, skeptics have sometimes tried to use that and say, see, the Bible is scientifically absurd, it's nonsense, it doesn't even get something as basic as the fact that the moon doesn't give light. But that's kind of a silly argument. I mean, anybody walking outside on a moon night, especially 5,000 years ago, would look up and say, look, the moon is lighting up the night. And we still even say that now, unless we're trying to prove the Bible wrong. We walk outside and there's a pretty full moon. We say, wow, it's really lit up the whole night. It's almost like daytime. Well, we know that the moon isn't generating the light. It's reflecting the light from the sun. And nothing in the Bible indicates that God or anybody in the Bible ever said that the moon is generating its own light, but it is a light giver at night, and we know that it is. And everybody, that's just a simple fact of our human experience. So don't let somebody tell you that proves Genesis is scientifically inaccurate. Now, let's get to the point about stars because this is where it gets really interesting. I always love this because in 5 words, now depending on which translation you're looking at, it says, He made the stars also. I mean, we go on and we spend a couple of chapters talking about the earth and man, which really points to the emphasis that, what God was really focused on. He created the universe to sustain the earth and created the earth to sustain man, his crowning achievement. The whole reason why he created the earth in the first place was a home for us where he could dwell in fellowship with us. So it's just interesting that the whole account of the stars is, and he made the stars also. I mean, it's very interesting. Everybody's heard of the Hubble Space Telescope. Now, I might be a little more familiar with it than most people because I worked on the space shuttle program for a while and I'm very familiar with the Hubble program. But the Hubble itself, initially revealed that there's an estimated with the deep field galaxy shots and stuff that there's 100 billion galaxies in the universe. But as we have fine tuned the technology of that telescope now, it's estimated there's probably closer to more like 200 billion galaxies, not stars, 200 billion galaxies. But given a lot of technical things, I'm not going to get into all that and bore you. Scientists are now estimating and believe that that's probably a really low estimate, and there's probably more like a couple of trillion galaxies in the universe. Now, whether it's 200 billion galaxies or 2 trillion galaxies, I mean, all that's still just mind-boggling numbers, especially when you then look at the fact that each galaxy contains millions to possibly trillions of stars, and then the distance in between each of those stars is millions to hundreds of billions or more light years apart. Now, a light year, of course, is how far light can travel in 1 year when light travels 186,000 miles per second. So that number becomes so big, we have to say a light year. Now, that kind of diminishes our amazement because we don't really stop and think about how far a light year is. And then you talk about stars that are 100 light years away, that are a million light years away, that are a billion light years away. And you're talking about, you know, 200 billion to 2 trillion galaxies that are all hundreds of billions or millions of light years apart that each contain hundreds of millions to hundreds of billions of stars that are all hundreds to millions to billions of light years apart. And it just becomes this, I mean, it's inconceivable to the human mind how big the universe is and how much is out there because every star, for the most part, is exponentially bigger than the Earth is. Now they're much more simple than the Earth. They're basically burning gases and very simple for the most part compared to the Earth, their composition. But there's almost an infinite number of these and an infinite amount of space out there. And yet Genesis describes it like this, and he made the stars also. I mean, that's the power of God. And I think by stating it like that, what he's trying to say is show how magnificently and infinitely powerful he is by just 5 words describing this unfathomable universe that we're sitting in. But then it also, again, I think it demonstrates the focus that the earth was his, where he was concentrating on, and that the rest of the universe was created to support the earth, which then in turn supported human life, which is what the whole point of God's creation was. So it's really mind boggling to think about the fact that, he made the sun. We get that. That's what, you know, generates all the heat and the power and the energy and life on earth. And he made the moon as a night, that's the tide. That has a lot to do with life, by the way, as well, by the way, with all the tides and everything that the moon does to the earth and how it helps sustain life as well. But then he made all this infinite number of stars in this infinite expanse of space, and he just did it by speaking it into existence. And it said he set the stars. That means it wasn't like this haphazard kind of, he didn't really know what he had done and just kind of sloppily threw this infinite number of stars out there, and wherever they landed, that's what happened. No, he set each star in place exactly where he wants that one to be and knows every single one of them by name personally. I mean, it's really just amazing and mind boggling. It doesn't cause you to, to really stop in amazement that you're not really understanding what's going on. And that leads us to the final point I want to end with in this lesson as we start to enter into the idea of teleology. Now, teleology is the explanation of that when something is designed for a purpose, that we know there must have been a designer. And when you look at things that are designed a very specific way, and it's very obvious that it has that design. Now, it's kind of funny because, atheistic scientists who don't believe in God will say that it just has the appearance of design. Well, what's the difference between design and the appearance of design? Well, it's just a play on words that says, well, it looks like it's designed, but let's don't call it design, because if we call it design, then we have to say there's a designer. So we're just going to say it has the appearance of design. It just kind of happened to end up that way. It's not really designed. It just looks like that. Now tell me, how foolish is that? And that's why I like the saying that says, it's unbelievable what unbelievers have to believe in order not to believe. So, one thing that an unbeliever has to believe is the whole universe and the earth looks like it is intricately, delicately, and perfectly designed with mind boggling complexity and delicate balance, but it's just an appearance of design. It's not real. It just happened that way. I mean, that's what you have to believe there's no designer. And of course, any person who doesn't just want to dismiss God out of hand and never consider him would never say, well, you know what, if there's these this mass insurmountable proof of design in the universe and on the earth, it must be because somebody designed it. And of course, you would be right by thinking that. Now, I have a list of, and this isn't even an exhaustive list, but a list of over 90 different things about the universe that are very delicate designs that if you changed any of them, it would have catastrophic effects on the universe. And of course, then on life on Earth, which the universe supports life on Earth. So I want to read a few of them to you just to kind of give you a taste of what they are. But this is that idea of teleology, that things were designed for a purpose to sustain life on Earth. And the reason why they look like they have design is, guess what? Because they do. And if they do have design, then of course there must be a designer. That designer is not an impersonal force, it is the personal God who designed things exactly the way they are to support life on Earth, which it does. All right, so let me just read you all 5 or 6 of these. If the expansion of the universe initially, remember, God stretched out the heavens, and we know even scientifically they can show in testable proof that the universe is expanding. And guess what? The Bible said God stretched out the heavens, and we don't understand exactly how he did that, but it does imply that the universe is stretching out. We see scientifically, we know that's true by measuring something called the redshift, right? Well, Stephen Hawking, who is not a Christian, who in fact is, I don't know if he ended up that way at his death, but for most of his life he was, an atheist. He said that if the expansion of the universe initially was different by one part in one, I think the number is quintillion, even though I'm not sure if that's accurate. It's one followed by 3, 6, 9, 12, 15 zeros. I think that might be quintillion. I may have the number wrong, but it's a big number, okay? One part in that big of a number, then the universe wouldn't have continued to expand. It would have snapped back on itself. It has to be expanding at exactly the right rate, like a rubber band or a balloon expanding, or it wouldn't have enough energy to keep expanding, it would collapse back on itself, or if it was expanding more, then it would fly apart. Okay, so it had to be expanding at exactly the right amount to a very just jaw-dropping precise degree. And that, again, that's from Stephen Hawking. That's not from some Christian who came up with that. So obviously the universe didn't evolve this way. There's no 1 in 1 quintillion chance it happened like that by accident. Sorry, that's not, anybody with a reasonable mind would say, well, that's a 0% chance it happened randomly, and it is practically zero. And uh, in all reasonable estimation, it means there's a zero chance it could happen. It had to have happened that way on purpose by a designer. Couple more here. If the Earth were a tiny bit closer to the sun, or just a little bit farther away, and we're talking by minuscule amounts of a percentage point, then we'd either burn up or we'd freeze to death. Same thing if the moon were a little bit closer. I mean, by just a little amount, I don't mean an inch, but a small percentage of where it's at now. If it was too close to the Earth, then the Earth would be rocked by catastrophic earthquakes and tsunami, huge, life-ending tsunamis because of the gravity. Or if it was a little farther away, we wouldn't have the tides and the seasons and the hydrological cycle. So obviously, God put it at exactly the right place to be able to support life on Earth. If the Earth were tilted at a little different angle, then life would cease. If our atmosphere was composed of just a little slightly bit different percentage of elements, then we wouldn't be able to exist. If water in its exact form, water's such a miracle. We covered that in a previous lesson. But if it was just a tiny bit different than it is now, then life wouldn't exist. Even dust has perfect design, and without it, life would cease to exist. It's why we have blue sky and rain and erosion at the strong nuclear forces, the weak force and the strong force of the nuclear force that holds atoms together. If it was a little bit different, then atoms would either implode on themselves or would fly apart. And gravity wasn't exactly the way it was. If the electromagnetic force wasn't exactly the way it was, if the mass density of the universe wasn't the way it was, if all the dark energy density wasn't exactly the way it was, if entropy wasn't exactly the way it was, if the velocity of light wasn't the way it was. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on. Everything in the universe seems to be in a very, very complex, delicately, perfectly placed reality in order for life to exist on the earth. Now, do you think all that happened by chance? Do you think a 1 in gazillion, quintillion chance that could all happen? That, oh yeah, that's what happened. Now, what some people will say, people who still will just suspend their logic because they refuse to consider that the Bible might be true, they'll say something like this: well, yeah, I can tell you it can happen. You know why? Because here we are. So the fact that it does exist, the fact that we are here, the fact that all these delicate balances are in place proves that this could happen by random chance, because there's no way that God doesn't exist. God couldn't have done it. And see how foolish that is? It's like saying, well, even though if we were applying those statistical odds to anything else, we'd say, no, there's a zero chance that could happen. When it comes to us existing, we take the same insurmountable statistical odds and say, well, yeah, it happened because we're here, aren't we? And that's just foolishness. Again, I go back to the saying, it's unbelievable what unbelievers have to believe in order to not believe in God. You have to ignore all of this and say, yes, it all happened by chance, beating any reasonable odds that we would ever apply to anything else. This all happened by chance. There is no designer. God didn't make the sun, moon, and stars the way they are. They just evolved that way. They happened over, and you couldn't give it. They've gone from hundreds of millions of years to a long time. It was 4.32 billion years. Now they're saying, no, it must have been, 20 something billion years. Well, they just think if you keep adding more time to it, as they realize how statistically impossible it is for this to occur, if we just add more time to it, eventually it will happen. And guess what? It's never going to happen. The odds of it happening are zero. You know why it's zero? Because it couldn't happen by itself. All of this complexity. I mean, here's 90 different things on this list. What are the statistical odds? I can't even imagine the number of one chance and whatever this number is, I would never even understand that 90 perfectly designed things could happen by chance in order to sustain life on earth. And that's what we're finding out as we study through the book of Genesis, that the account in Genesis 1 is scientifically accurate. It does make sense. It is logical. It's not these absurd myths and legends that other creation stories come up with. It makes perfect sense from what we know of physics and science, quantum physics, and all those things that we've discovered in recent history. The Bible has already told us things that match exactly what we are discovering, this obvious design, this perfect balance. And later on, when we get to days 5 and 6, then we're going to see the same type of thing in the animal life and the plant life. So that's the end of part 12. And I'll see you next time on part 13, where we will pick up our study in on verse 20 in Genesis chapter 1.